The American Soccer League was founded in 1988, and two teams from the Miami area, Fort Lauderdale Strikers and Miami Sharks, were founded to be inaugural teams in the newly founded league. Previously in a series, I talked about a team called the Miami Americans that also played in a league called the American Soccer League in 1980. Now that I'm saying that this American Soccer League was founded in 1988, it's obviously not the same league as that one. The league that the Miami Americans played in existed from 1933 to 1983, so just under 50 years. In large part, ended up folding because of overexpansion. The league also served markets all over America, whereas this newly founded one only served eastern markets in the US, while the Western Soccer Alliance, which later rebranded to just be named a much more boring name in the Western Soccer League, served the Western American markets. At this point, the North American Soccer League had also folded come the end of the 1984 season, less than 4 years before this league began. Now let's introduce the two teams, the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. There have been 4 iterations of the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. I'm going to go in a little bit of a weird order, briefly going over which team is which. So the third team was basically a minor league, which for one season was named the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. The fourth iteration was a pretty notable team that played in the North American Soccer League, the new version of it that many of you guys may be familiar with. Now, the first iteration was the Fort Lauderdale Strikers that played in the old NASL. And the old NASL version was by far the most notable. One of the reasons why they were the biggest kind of iteration of the Fort Lauderdale Strikers of those 4 teams, they had players like Gerd Muller, who was one of the best players who ever played for the German national team. Then I believe they had George Best for a short period of time, who was one of the best English national team players. And then they also had Gordon Banks, who was also another English national team player. They also had former South American Player of the Year and Peruvian Teofilo Subias, and he ended up playing for this American Soccer League Fort Lauderdale Strikers as well for a season. So because of that, they had so many good players that made them one of the most notable teams, and they also had many successes on the pitch as well as off the pitch. They got pretty good attendance in the time that they existed. This was the second iteration. This was actually owned by Joe Robbie, the Florida Dolphins owner, whose wife owned the previous team that was named the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. So this was not the same team as the one that played in NASL. That team would end up being moved to Minnesota, and then it ended up folding. This was kind of Joe Robbie and Elizabeth Robbie's new venture back into soccer. And they would own controlling interests of the team, but a man named Noel Lemon, he would become more notable in the future, was minority owner. They would play at Lockhart Stadium 2 as well, which was the same stadium that the NASL Strikers played in. Now, the Miami Sharks. The Sharks were a lot less notable. It would reflect in their performances over the course of their existence. It was kind of a theme that they were overshadowed by the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. They were owned by a Brazilian named Gerson Correa, a businessman, and would play at Tamiami Stadium, the former home of the former NASL team, the Miami Toros. So one of the things that you'll see in this video is that there's stark differences between the Miami Sharks and the Fort Lauderdale Strikers of the American Soccer League. Let's not forget that the Miami Sharks were kind of a new brand. They were this fully new brand of a team. There was no team previous that was named the Miami Sharks. And they just came into Miami, and historically they had former Miami teams had not done very well in the city of Miami. They had done better in the past in Fort Lauderdale. I mean, if we look at the Fort Lauderdale Strikers of the old NASL, they did it a lot better. So that trend continued in this video. You'd look at the Miami Sharks, they would get 1,000 or 2,000 fans per game on average, while the Fort Lauderdale Strikers were getting, 4,000 fans per game on average, which wasn't as good as they were doing in the NASL, but the NASL seems like a lot more of a stable league than this American Soccer League that was only playing in the East Coast. It really didn't seem anywhere close to as big of a league as, the North American Soccer League was back in its heyday. But because of this legacy of having a team named the Fort Lauderdale Strikers when just a little bit previous, just less than a decade before, there was a team called Fort Lauderdale Strikers that was very notable in that Fort Lauderdale community, while you look at the Miami Sharks and they didn't have very notable players, but they didn't have too many notable players. They weren't a notable brand. They didn't play very well. There was very stark differences between performances, and it ultimately led to this big disparity between the two Miami teams. So Brazilian star Carlos Alberto was hired to be the first manager of the Sharks. You'd think that he would be a good manager, being that he had such a great playing career, but after poor results he ended up getting fired after less than one season. One of the things too that's also good to note is that the Fort Lauderdale Strikers, they bring in a lot of older players from their former Fort Lauderdale Strikers team, and this was very helpful for them, as if you look at some of the players that they brought, they bring in Ray Hudson, who's a pretty notable figure in commentating. He also ended up managing Miami Fusion, the first MLS team in Miami. Now the second team's in Inter Miami, and actually he's on the broadcast team for Inter Miami. And then they also signed Thomas Rongen, who came from the former Fort Lauderdale Strikers team. And then they also signed Teofilo Subias, who would be there for a season and then ended up leaving at the end of the season. So these players would end up helping the team kind of bring former fans who watched the previous North American Soccer League team, and it bring bigger brand names to the smaller American Soccer League team. The teams in the 1988 season were two opposites, as the Miami Sharks finished last while the Strikers finished first and made it to the finals. The Strikers made it all the way to the finals that season, but ended up losing over two legs to the Washington Diplomats. Now Noel Lemon, who is the minority owner, he would kind of use Teofilo Subias, who skipped a practice a few days before the game. He kind of used him as a scapegoat for the finals loss, so he ended up terminating his contract at the end of the season. Joe Robbie was kind of a little bit like he wanted to get out of this venture. His health was declining and his wife's health was declining, so in early 1989 he sold majority interest to Noel Lemon, and unfortunately they would pass away over the next few years. Trends continued for the two teams. Thomas Rongen now re-signed with the Strikers. This time, instead of being a player, he became the head coach, because it seems like the original one was fired. They'd go to the finals and win the ASL Championship against the Boston Bolts. Since they won the ASL Championship, they would play the champion of the Western Soccer League in a national championship match. And the champion of the Western Soccer League this year in 1989 was the San Diego Nomads. So they played them and ended up beating them 3-1. So they became basically the champions of American soccer in the 1989 season. Now we're going to talk about the APSL years. But in 1990, the American Professional Soccer League was founded, or the APSL, merging the Western Soccer League and the Eastern-based American Soccer League to have a somewhat united league. The Miami Sharks were bought by a new owner, Julio Moreira, and rebranded to the Miami Freedom. And they would go and play in the Orange Bowl, and they would only get 1,000 fans on average per game, I heard, which Orange Bowl was a 75,000 capacity stadium at the time. So just imagine being a fan in that stadium, being one of those 1,000 fans in a 75,000 capacity stadium. So almost no one's in the stadium. And yeah, I mean, that would be a pretty cavernous atmosphere and a pretty awkward atmosphere as a fan. They would have their best season in 1990. Their inaugural season being named the Miami Freedom. And how did they do well? How did they do? They had their best season ever in their history, if you include the years of the Miami Sharks. And they would have the best season over the course of their existence. You know where they finished? They finished 18th out of 22 teams. Yep, that's the best they could do. Because in 1991, they finished last. In 1992, they finished last, and at the end of the season, they would fold, and I'll get onto that in just a second. I think that just sums up how bad the Miami Sharks were. In the many seasons from 1988 to 1992. The Fort Lauderdale Strikers would continue to be successful, finishing first in the league in 1990. They made it to the APSL finals and they lost again. And then they finished first in their conference in the 1991 season. They struggled with finances as Noel Lemon was not very wealthy, so he sold the team to Amancio Suarez. So things got really weird once the following thing happened. So a man named Amancio Suarez owned the Miami Freedom. He bought them out in 1992. Now he would be a very notable figure for the Miami area in terms of their American Professional Soccer League history, as he would own them for a few years, and then he noticed that the Fort Lauderdale Strikers were up for sale. So he saw, I've got this terrible team that's finishing last every season. It's not getting good fan support. I'm gonna ditch this team. So he ditched the Miami Freedom. He folded them, and then he bought out the Fort Lauderdale Strikers, who I guess were the greener grass on the other side of the road. And he bought them out and saw that they were getting better attendances, they had better fan support, they had a better legacy, they had better results. They had a better history alone in the ASL and the APSL, where you look at the Miami Sharks and Freedom, and they just performed terribly, really every single season of their existence. So he would buy them out, and he had them for 2 years, and then he ended up folding them right before APSL was rebranded to the A-League, which, yes, it's the same name as the league in Australia. But yeah, that was the end of both the Fort Lauderdale Strikers and the Miami Sharks and Freedom. I think that really shows you the stark differences between these two teams. Here's the Miami Sharks and Freedom on one side that performed very bad on the pitch and in terms of fan support the whole time. And then here's the Fort Lauderdale Strikers, where, they weren't as great as the heyday of the Fort Lauderdale Strikers back in the 70s and 80s. But he saw that the grass was greener on the other side in terms of Fort Lauderdale Strikers being the greener grass. And he decided to pick the Fort Lauderdale Strikers over Miami. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. Please like this video if you enjoy it. Please also check out funwhileatlasta.com. I got a lot of info about this team since it's a smaller team from that website, so I just felt that I should say that they're a big source for this video since I got so much information from them. Also check out other videos on Miami soccer history from my channel. I made 4 videos previous to this. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. Until next time, see ya.